Peter was the kind of boy who wanted everything now, right now. He was always daydreaming. In school, his teachers were always scolding him because he was looking out the window and dreaming of all the fun he would have when school would let out and he could run through the forest. But once he was in the forest, he would lie under a tree and daydream and dream about what he would do when he was all grown up and could marry Lisa, a beautiful girl in his class that he had liked ever since he was much younger. And one day, when he was walking through the forest, he met an old woman. Now, if he had thought a bit more, perhaps he would have been more careful. Perhaps he would have asked her who she was, or why she said she wanted to help him. But he never did, and so he never knew. Because she held out the shining crystal ball. "Look, Peter. You want time to pass more quickly. Well, with this you can. You see?" Peter stared at it, as if in a trance. The crystal ball glittered as if it were made out of diamond, and there was a tiny golden thread creeping out of one side of the ball as if it were a snail from coming out of a shell. A beautiful, sparkling golden thread that once it crept out just a little bit seemed to vanish in the air and disappear. It was coming out slowly, slowly. "This is the string of time," said the old woman. "Just pull a little bit if you want it to go faster." "Really?" said Peter. "Oh, yes," said the old woman. "But do be careful, because once you pull it out, you cannot push it back in again." "And I can have it?" said Peter. "Of course," said the old woman. "Anyone can." Peter snatched up that beautiful crystal ball and ran away with it as fast as he could before she changed her mind. And all that night he watched it. He watched it glitter. He watched that beautiful sparkly golden thread creep out just a tiny little bit at a time and vanish into the air. Well, the next morning, Peter took the crystal ball hidden carefully in his pocket until he got to school. And as he was at school, he pulled it out and watched it. "Peter," said the teacher, "pay attention. Are you daydreaming again?" Peter looked up at the clock on the wall and saw that there were still so many hours until school would let out. And then he thought, "Wow, let's see if this really works." And he pulled the golden thread just a tiny little bit, and suddenly he heard the school bell. The school bell was ringing to let everyone out. The whole morning had passed, and he hadn't even noticed. It worked! He put away the crystal ball and raced outside, quickly picking up his books, running back home, running to play in the forest, and he had so much fun. The next day, went back to school. Oh, he was so tired, and the lessons were so boring. And he looked at that clock, and there were hours yet to go. And even though the old woman had told him to be careful, to not use it too often, he thought, "Well, I'm not learning anything useful in school anyway." And he pulled the string again. And once again, the bell was ringing, and the whole morning had passed without him even noticing. Well, now that Peter had this, every day he would pull the string just a little bit to make the school pass quickly. But pretty soon, after a few days of this, he thought, "What's the point of that? Every day I'm coming back to school and why don't I just pull a little bit harder? And then the whole school season will be over and it'll be vacation." And sure enough, he pulled the string a little bit harder. And all the year had passed. Peter found himself packing up his bags, saying goodbye to all his classmates, and skipping out the door of the school to a whole long period of vacation. He enjoyed it at first, but then he realized that he didn't see Lisa anymore. He did love seeing her and teasing her every day in school, and now that he was on vacation and she had gone somewhere else with her family, he kind of missed her, you know. And he tried to enjoy vacation as much as he could, but pretty soon he's found himself wishing for school to start again so that he could hang out with Lisa some more and show her some of the things he'd been doing, and so that they could laugh and play together. And finally, even though he knew he shouldn't, he pulled the string and found himself back at school, and Lisa was looking more beautiful than ever. Well, this went by, and as Peter grew older, he and Lisa started falling in love. And he started realizing that, well, they were just wasting time here in school. Oh, the day when he would be all grown up and could marry Lisa, and they could be happy, so happy together. What was the point of school anyway? What was the point of being a kid? You were just wasting time. Being a grown-up, having your own money, that was what really counted. And finally, he pulled the string. Longer than he ever had. And he looked around. He was graduating. He took the hat off, threw it up into the air. They were cheering and clapping. Oh, he was so happy. He had graduated with really bad grades, but oh well, who cared? He'd made it. It was time. He was old enough now. He could get a job and he could marry Lisa. He saw his parents clapping and oh, his mother. His mother looked so old now. There were wrinkles in her face that he hadn't noticed, and her hair was starting to turn silver. And he suddenly felt guilty that he had made time pass so quickly, and his mother had grown old before his very eyes, and he hadn't even noticed. And he hadn't spent any meaningful time with her in all these years that had passed. Peter felt very guilty about this, and he decided that he wasn't going to pull the string anymore, because that would just make his mother grow even more older and more tired, and no. But he had all his life ahead of him, and he and Lisa, holding hands, skipped off into the sunset. But they couldn't get married yet. At least that's what Lisa said. They were still quite young, they didn't have any experience, they didn't have any real jobs, they didn't have enough money to buy a house, and what would they, if they got married and had children? They couldn't afford children at the time. Let's wait a few years, she said. After we become professional and we can get a job and get settled down and have a house, then we can get married. Oh, Peter could barely wait. He finally found the first job he could, but he hated it. It was so boring. Every day doing the same thing, day in, day out, and pretty soon, even though he told himself that he wouldn't, he found himself pulling the string just a little bit to get through the day's work and go back home and visit Lisa in the evenings. But as time passed, he was just more and more miserable. That job, yes, he was barely scraping enough, and it saw that he was going to take a lot longer than he expected to save enough to buy a house. And finally, after one particularly bad day at work when the boss had yelled at him and he had felt humiliated, and he was tired and he was grumpy, he pulled the thread even harder. And suddenly, he found himself living in an apartment with Lisa. Yes, they were married. Oh, he hugged her tightly. Oh, he was so delighted. Finally, he was happy. And Lisa smiled at him. But, well, he was still in that job he hated, you know? And it was so boring. And he felt his life slipping away. Every day when he got up, he had to go to work again. And once again, even though he was married to Lisa and he was very happy, he found himself pulling the string just a little bit at a time. Well, pretty soon, Almost before he noticed, they had a baby together. And Peter's baby daughter was so beautiful and precious, and he felt this was true happiness. He felt he wanted to be here and now and never pull that string again and live every single moment with his daughter. Except for when she cried. And when she cried all night long. Peter couldn't sleep just when he was just about to fall asleep, so exhausted. And he would turn and look at Lisa, and Lisa was just as tired as he was, if not more, and he would drag himself out of bed and go and change her stinky diaper. And then he would try to go to sleep, and pretty soon he found himself pulling out that crystal ball and pulling just a little bit just so he could get through those sleepless nights. By now he'd noticed something strange. The golden thread had started changing color. It wasn't quite as sparkly or as golden anymore. In fact, it was starting to look like silver. Well, the nights continued. He could never rest. The job was terrible. He kept fighting with his boss more and more often. Quit his job, found another one. It was even worse. He was struggling to pay the bills. He was stressed. Lisa was tired. The baby was crying. And finally he decided, just a little bit, until the baby's old enough to not keep us up every night. And so he pulled. And sure enough, now the baby was a cute, chubby-cheeked little toddler running around, knocking into things. But now there was another baby, a second one. And the same thing happened all over again. And pretty soon, Peter just felt more and more frustrated, especially because he started feeling that things weren't going very well with Lisa. He didn't know how or why or when, but she didn't smile at him as often. She didn't seem as happy, and he certainly didn't feel happy. And so he pulled the string even harder, and in the evenings, instead of going home and having to change diapers and having to see a grumpy wife, he would often go to the bar and have some drinks with his friends, and then he would go home. Well, his kids grew, and he also started noticing that whenever he would visit his mother, now his mother really looked old, and he felt very guilty. But there were bills to pay, and there were problems at work, and and the kids took up so much energy and time, and finally he thought, just until they're older and can fend for themselves, and he pulled the string a bit harder, and now his kids were teenagers. Finally I'll have some rest, he thought. Oh no. For some reason, his kids were always fighting with him. They said, of all things, that he was never around. What do you mean I'm never around? He cried out in great frustration. I've sacrificed my entire life for you, you ungrateful children. I've done everything for you. I'm working in this job I hate. All my life is just for you. And he was constantly fighting with them. But they would scream at him and slam their door and lock themselves in their room. And Peter felt more and more unhappy. He would turn to Lisa, thinking that she would take his side, but she would just look down. She didn't look happy either. And one day, after one horrible fight, a screaming match in which he had thrown some plates and broken them on the floor, and his eldest daughter had screamed at him that he was the worst father in the world and that she never wanted to speak to him again, and she left. She left the house slamming the door and got in her car and drove away. Peter couldn't stand it. He turned to Lisa, and Lisa just looked down and said, "Sometimes I think about leaving too." "That's it!" he cried. "That's it! No more!" And he pulled out the crystal ball and pulled hard, very hard. He wanted to retire. He wouldn't have to be in that stupid job anymore. His kids would be grown up, have their own families. Everything would be all right. He would have grandchildren to play with. Now, once he was retired, he would have time to spend with Lisa, and they could travel the world and do all the things that they'd said that they wanted to do. And he pulled that string so hard that he found himself an old man. Very old. He found himself standing in a cemetery. And suddenly all the years that had rushed past in a second came crashing down upon him, and he realized all that had happened in all those years that had gone by in an instant. His children had left. He didn't speak to them anymore. They were still bitterly fighting. Lisa had never left him, but she had never been happy. She had died. Lisa had died before they'd managed to do any of their plans. And his mother had died as well, and he had barely visited her. In those last few days, she had died alone and feeling forgotten in an old folks' home, far away. And Peter found himself standing in front of the graves of his wife and his mother. The funeral of his wife had just happened, and he saw his children on the other side of the cemetery, staring at him. He stared back bitterly. Well, if they weren't going to talk to him, he wasn't going to talk to them either. And he pulled out the crystal ball, and he saw that now the thread that was creeping out slowly, ever so slowly, was no longer silver but a dull gray. And it was creeping out. The last of his life was ticking away. No, he said, and he tried to shove the thread back inside, but he couldn't. It just dissolved in his fingers, and it kept on creeping out slowly. His children came up, and it seemed as if his daughter was just about to say something, but he turned his back to her. He had to get the thread back inside. He had to go back. He had to go back in time and do things. He barely remembered anything. He barely lived any of this. He couldn't have lost it all. And the last few days he spent desperately trying to shove that thread back until finally, alone in his house, the last little bit of thread fell out and vanished. No! He cried. No! Nobody went to his funeral or even cried when he died. Hardly anybody remembered him. In fact, funny, it was almost as if he had never lived at all.